The air inside the house at 412 Maple Lane always tasted faintly of old copper and lemon wax, a stagnant, suffocating blend that had not changed in over 2 decades. Elara Sterling stood in the dim twilight of her kitchen, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the laminate countertop. Outside, the suburban Philadelphia sky was bruising into a deep, unforgiving violet, casting long, skeletal shadows across the linoleum floor. From the adjacent utility closet, the rhythmic metallic screech of the washing machine tore through the silence. Clank shhh screech. Clank shhh screech. It was an ancient, rusted Maytag, a relic from the late 90s that shuddered violently against the drywall with every spin cycle. To anyone else, it was merely a noisy household appliance. To Elara, it was the metronome of her entire adult life, a loud, grating monument to 26 years of enforced frugality. She closed her eyes, listening to the machine groan. She could still hear Thomas's voice, flat and unyielding as granite, echoing from the memory of a Tuesday evening 3 years ago. The water pump had failed, flooding the linoleum, when she had suggested softly, tentatively, that perhaps it was time to buy a new one. Thomas had simply sat at the kitchen table, methodically folding a single coupon into neat, sharp squares. He hadn't raised his voice. He never did. He had simply looked past her, his eyes 2 chips of cold gray slate, and submerged the room in 48 hours of absolute, freezing silence. The message was clear, written in the heavy air: we do not spend. We do not replace. We survive. So, Elara had spent 3 days on her knees with a wrench and a YouTube tutorial, patching up the rusted pump while Thomas watched the evening news, completely ignoring the grease on her hands. That was the essence of Thomas Sterling. He was a senior logistics coordinator for a regional freight company, a man who mapped out the most efficient, cheapest routes for giant diesel trucks, and he ran his home like a budgeting spreadsheet. He told her his salary started at $500 a month when they married in 2000, creeping up sluggishly to $2,200 by the time he retired. Elara's own modest income as an adjunct English instructor at the local community college was immediately absorbed into the joint checking account, vanishing into the black hole of necessities. They clipped coupons until their thumbs were stained with newsprint. They spent summers sweating in Pennsylvania state parks, sleeping on thin foam mats, because hotels were an extravagance. Elara wore the same charcoal blazer to faculty meetings for 9 years, its cuffs frayed into tiny gray whiskers that she carefully trimmed with nail scissors every Sunday night. She had accepted it. She had genuinely believed that this was the honorable, quiet American struggle of a working-class marriage. She had convinced herself that Thomas's coldness was just the stoic nature of a reliable man. Then came the autumn of 2017, a memory that still carried the sharp, sterile scent of rubbing alcohol and cheap hospital coffee. Elara's mother had fallen, shattering her hip. The insurance was a labyrinth of exclusions, leaving a glaring $4,000 deficit before the surgeons would even schedule the operation. Elara remembered standing in the concrete parking lot of Pennsylvania General Hospital, the November wind whipping her face until her skin felt raw and chapped. The tears had frozen on her cheeks as she held the flip phone to her ear, sobbing into the receiver to her husband. "Thomas, please," she had whispered, her voice breaking against the roar of distant highway traffic. "The hospital needs the deposit tonight. I don't know what to do. She's in so much pain." There had been a long pause on the other end of the line, the agonizing, heavy silence that always made Elara feel like an intrusive stranger in her own life. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice was a low, measured drawl. "We don't have that kind of liquidity. Elara, you know the budget is tight this quarter. We'll figure something out. We always do." That night, he had sat on their faded velvet sofa, his large, rough hand covering hers. His palm was calloused and dry, scraping against her skin like sandpaper. He had looked into her eyes with a terrifyingly convincing expression of helpless sorrow, letting her weep, letting her believe they were drowning in poverty. They had eventually scraped the $4,000 together by draining Elara's tiny personal savings and cutting their grocery budget to the bone for a year. He had let her carry the crushing guilt of that money. He had let it feel enormous. 14 months ago, the silence became permanent. Thomas had suffered a massive, quiet, unremarkable heart attack at his desk, his coffee mug still warm when the paramedics found him. The aftermath had been an administrative fog, dictated by a modest, predictable will. The house was left to Elara, along with a $45,000 life insurance policy that was instantly swallowed by the funeral expenses and a leaking roof. His 401k held a meager $18,000. That was it. That was the grand sum of Thomas Sterling's earthly existence, leaving Elara to navigate her grief in a chilly house, rationing the heating oil, and listening to the agonizing screech of the broken washing machine. She walked over to the utility closet, her shoes slapping softly against the cold floor. She pressed her palm against the vibrating metal door of the Maytag, feeling the violent hum rattle the bones in her wrist. The machine gave one final, desperate shudder and died, leaving the kitchen plunged once more into the suffocating, heavy dark. 14 months of loneliness, 14 months of counting pennies, all while the ghost of a man she thought she knew completely continued to rule her from the grave. The silence left by the dead washing machine lingered in the house for weeks, heavy and unyielding. It was now late October, 14 months since the funeral. The air outside had grown crisp, carrying the brittle, smoky scent of dying autumn leaves and the damp chill of impending frost. Inside the house, the atmosphere felt increasingly cramped, as if the walls themselves were closing in on Elara's solitary routine. Needing to refinance the mortgage to keep up with the rising property taxes, Elara finally forced herself to confront the top shelf of Thomas's home office closet, a dust-covered sanctuary she had avoided since the day he died. The closet smelled strongly of his presence, a mixture of stale tobacco, cedarwood, and the faint chemical tang of the industrial hand sanitizer he always used. Stepping onto a sturdy wooden stool, she reached her hand into the dark, cavernous recesses of the upper shelf. Her fingers brushed against the rough canvas of an old gym bag, then past a stack of faded yellow legal pads. Just as she was about to pull back, her knuckles grazed something flat and solid hidden against the bare plaster of the back wall. It was a heavy cardboard shoebox, its corners reinforced with yellowed packing tape. She brought it down, the cardboard feeling surprisingly heavy and cold in her hands. When she pried open the lid, expecting to find the mundane receipts of a hyperfrugal man, her breath caught in her throat. Tucked beneath a thick manila envelope was a sleek, matte black digital security token, the kind used by ultra-high net worth individuals for encrypted banking authentication, and a single sheet of heavy, textured cream paper. The paper bore the elegant, raised silver letterhead of First Meridian Private Bank, located on North Michigan Avenue in Chicago. The document was a comprehensive portfolio statement dated March 2021, a mere 18 months before Thomas's sudden death. Elara squinted at the bottom line in the dim afternoon light filtering through the window blind. The digits printed their blurred, then snapped into terrifyingly sharp focus. $33,241,780.04. $33,241,780.04. The room tilted. The only sound was the frantic, erratic thumping of her own pulse echoing in her ears. Her skin went completely cold, goosebumps erupting along her arms despite the wool sweater she wore. She sat down heavily on the hardwood floor of the closet, the dust motes dancing lazily in the single shaft of sunlight beside her. She stared at the name of the account holder, R.A. Miller Logistics Consulting, LLC. Below it, a detailed subtext indicated that the funds were held entirely within an offshore irrevocable trust based in the Cayman Islands. A dizzying wave of realization washed over her, tasting like ash. This was why the IRS had never sent a Form 1099 to their suburban home. This was why their joint tax returns, which she had signed every April with blind trust, looked completely pristine. The money didn't legally exist on American soil. It was a ghost fortune, insulated by international maritime banking laws and shielded by a shell company she had never heard of. For nearly an hour, Elara remained frozen on the floor, the heavy cream paper trembling violently between her fingertips. The sheer, staggering cruelty of the contrast paralyzed her. $33 million existed under his name, while she had spent the last decade hunting for loose change in the couch cushions to buy groceries, while her mother's body had been broken because they supposedly couldn't afford proper medical care. When the paralysis finally dissolved into a cold, driving desperation, she stood up on unstable legs, walked to the kitchen, and picked up the landline phone. With numbers copied from the silver-embossed statement, she dialed the private Chicago line. The phone rang twice, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the kitchen stillness. A man answered. His voice was smooth, perfectly modulated, and carried the sterile, unbothered calm of old money. First Meridian Private Bank. This is Gerald Bloom. Elara swallowed hard, her throat feeling as dry as parchment. My name is Elara Sterling, she said, her voice shaking but clear. I am the widow of Thomas Sterling. I have just found a private statement for account number 8802, and I need to understand exactly what I am looking at. There was a sudden, heavy pause on the line. It wasn't the silence of confusion, but the calculated, deliberate hesitation of a professional legal guardian shifting gears. Elara could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of a high-end clock on his end of the line, and the crisp rustle of paper being moved. When Gerald Bloom spoke again, he delivered exactly 3 words that shattered the last remnants of the life Elara thought she knew. He left instructions. The floor seemed to drop away beneath her feet. Before she could demand an explanation, Bloom's voice resumed its polished, uninformative barrier. He confirmed the account's validity and stated that due to the extraordinary, sensitive nature of the offshore trust, no specifics could be disclosed over the phone. Mrs. Sterling, Bloom murmured, his tone dripping with formal, distant sympathy. If you wish to review the associated documents and the explicit directives left by your late husband, you must present yourself in person at our Chicago branch. You will need to bring your legal identification, Mr. Sterling's official death certificate, and certified documentation proving your status as the surviving spouse. We will be expecting you. The line went dead, leaving a hollow, buzzing dial tone that vibrated against Elara's ear. She lowered the receiver slowly. The kitchen smelled of the cheap, generic coffee she had brewed that morning, a bitter reminder of her enforced poverty. But the true poison was the sudden, sickening realization of who else was involved. As she looked back at the statement, she noticed a small, coded addendum regarding the trust structural layout. The primary beneficiaries upon the settler's death were designated via specific percentage allocations, 60% to Cassandra Miller Sterling and 40% to Julian Thorne, her sister-in-law, and her husband, the very people who called her every month to check in on her meager finances, offering condescending pity, while sitting on the secret of a lifetime. Elara dropped the paper onto the table, the silver letterhead catching the last glint of the fading, cold autumn sun. The train ride from Philadelphia to Chicago was a blur of gray, rainy landscapes, but the interior of First Meridian Private Bank was an alternate universe of absolute, suffocating privilege. Elara sat in a secluded, wood-paneled conference room on North Michigan Avenue, the air smelling of expensive leather upholstery and the faint, bitter aroma of dark roast espresso. Across the polished mahogany table sat Gerald Bloom, his silver hair immaculate, his face a pristine, unreadable mask of corporate discretion. Without a word, Bloom slid a heavy, wax-sealed manila envelope across the table. The wax bore the distinct imprint of Thomas's signet ring. Elara's fingers trembled as she broke the seal, the crisp snap of the wax echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. Inside was a thick stack of legal documents and a handwritten letter. The ink faded, but the penmanship unmistakably Thomas's, sharp, rigid, and disciplined. As her eyes traced the lines, the true, dark architecture of her 26-year marriage began to unravel, tasting like copper and ash in her mouth. Elara, the letter began, the words cold yet desperate. If you are reading this, the shadow has finally consumed me, and you have found the token. You have spent decades believing I am a miserly, unfeeling stone. The truth is, I am a hostage. The letter detailed a sickening reality from the summer of 2001. As a young logistics coordinator, Thomas had made a catastrophic, technically illegal accounting oversight that resulted in a massive corporate deficit. His brother-in-law, Julian Thorne, already a ruthless, rising mogul in Scottsdale's commercial real estate scene, had discovered the blunder. Instead of exposing Thomas, Julian bought the debt and used it as permanent, suffocating leverage. Julian forced Thomas to establish Miller Logistics Consulting, LLC, a shell company designed for one purpose: to launder the off-the-books cash flow from Julian's predatory real estate syndicates, funneling it into an unassailable offshore trust in the Cayman Islands. For 20 years, Thomas was trapped, forced to live like a poor man to avoid drawing the eyes of the federal government, while Julian and Cassandra pulled the strings from their desert mansion. But the deepest, most jagged laceration to Elara's heart came on the second page. Thomas confessed that the initial $40,000 seed money used to incorporate the shell company in June 2001 had been secretly withdrawn from their joint checking account while Elara was in Pittsburgh attending her father's retirement party. It was the entirety of the inheritance her father had given her, money she had been told was lost to a banking audit error. Her husband had stolen her own family's legacy to fund the very machine that imprisoned them. Yet, the final pages shifted from a confession into a calculated act of war. Thomas had grown sick of living as a puppet under the constant, frigid threat of exposure. In 2018, right after he watched Elara weep in the hospital parking lot over her mother's surgery, an incident that the letter revealed had utterly broken his remaining resolve, he secretly revolted. He went to an independent firm and drafted a devastating trigger clause into the offshore trust. The clause stated that because the initial capitalization of the trust was derived from the non-consensual misappropriation of Elara's personal marital assets, the entire trust structure would be rendered completely void if she ever discovered it and filed a formal claim. Thomas had turned his guilt into a weapon. He concluded the letter with a directive that made Elara's skin prickle with sudden heat. I have prepaid a non-refundable retainer for Eleanor Penhaligon, the sharpest estate litigator in Philadelphia. The token in the box is the key to the Cayman ledgers. I was too weak to fight them in life, Elara, but I have built a door inside their wall. Take the token. Go to Eleanor. Destroy them. The neon sign of the Chicago hotel room hummed a low, buzzing B-flat, casting a rhythmic pulse of amber light across the generic polyester bedspread. Elara sat on the edge of the mattress, the silence of the room thick and suffocating, smelling faintly of carpet cleaner and ozone. For the first few hours, she let the tears come, hot, silent streaks that scalded her cheeks as she mourned the utter waste of 26 years. She wept for the invisible woman she had been, the woman who had meticulously measured out laundry detergent and skipped dinners to save $3, all while a fortress of $33 million sat rotting in the tropics. But as the clock crawled past 3 a.m., something shifted inside the chilly dark of the room. The rhythmic blinking of the amber neon light no longer felt like a warning. It felt like a countdown. She caught her reflection in the vanity mirror, pale, dark circles under hollow eyes, shoulders slumped under a threadbare wool sweater. A wave of intense, visceral revulsion washed over her, tasting like cold iron. No more, she thought. The sorrow did not vanish, but it hardened, condensing into a dense, heavy stone of pure, rational resolve. Thomas had been her silent tormentor. Yes, but he had also left her the dynamite to blow up the prison. Sitting there, Elara consciously stripped away the heavy, suffocating cloak of the victim. Mourning was a luxury she could no longer afford. She needed to become an architect of retribution. When she returned to Philadelphia, the transformation began with deliberate, physical actions. She walked into a small salon near the campus, the air fragrant with eucalyptus and sharp hairspray, and watched in the mirror as 30 inches of dry, silver-streaked hair fell to the floor in heavy, silent clumps. She emerged with a sharp, chin-length bob that exposed the firm line of her jaw. She went to a local boutique, her fingers brushing past the soft, apologetic cardigans she usually bought, and chose a structured charcoal blazer with sharp geometric shoulders and a crisp white poplin shirt that smelled intensely of new fabric and starch. When she looked in the mirror, she no longer saw a ghost. She saw an adversary. The next morning, she climbed the narrow, creaking stairs of a historic brick townhouse in downtown Philadelphia to the office of Eleanor Penhaligon. The space was beautiful in its severity, walls lined with ceiling-high oak bookshelves housing thousands of leather-bound legal volumes, the air thick with the comforting, earthy scent of old paper and beeswax. Eleanor sat behind a sprawling desk of dark walnut. She was a formidable woman of 50, with sharp, bird-like eyes behind tortoiseshell reading glasses and a voice like smooth, aged bourbon. "Thomas paid the retainer 4 years ago, Mrs. Sterling," Eleanor said, sliding a thick legal folder forward. The paper felt heavy, substantial. He knew Julian Thorne would eventually try to bleed him dry. He built the trap, but you are the only one who can spring it. Grace did not just nod and sign the papers. She demanded to understand every cog in the machine. Over the next 3 weeks, her dining room table vanished beneath mountains of financial documents, tax codes, and international banking ledgers. She traded her classic poetry books for thick volumes on offshore asset protection and forensic accounting. She spent her nights squinting under the sharp glare of a desk lamp, her fingers tracing the serpentine flow of money from Miller Logistics Consulting LLC to the shell accounts in the Cayman Islands. She learned the vocabulary of high finance, fiduciary duty, fraudulent concealment, marital waste, treating them like weapons she was sharpening for battle. Under Eleanor's meticulous guidance, Elara executed her first major strategic maneuver. Instead of filing a standard probate claim, they submitted a comprehensive application for innocent spouse relief directly to the Internal Revenue Service and the federal courts. Elara sat before a court stenographer, her voice steady and clear, providing decades of joint tax returns, grocery receipts, and utility bills. She proved, with terrifyingly cold documentation, that she had been completely insulated from Thomas's corporate filings, entirely unaware of the shell companies, and a victim of severe economic coercion. By the time the paperwork was officially processed, Eleanor looked at Elara over the rims of her glasses, a rare, sharp smile touching her lips. "You've completely insulated yourself, Elara. The IRS cannot touch you for Thomas or Julian's crimes. The shield is up. Now we swing the sword." The November rain did not merely fall. It assaulted the suburbs of Philadelphia with a feral, freezing fury, throwing heavy sheets of near-glacial water against the dark brick facade of Elara Sterling's townhouse. Inside, The small living room was illuminated only by the amber, flickering glow of a dying fireplace and a single vintage brass floor lamp. The air carried the faint, earthy scent of steeped cinnamon bark and the clean, sharp smell of the fresh white paint Elara had applied to the baseboards the weekend before, a quiet, tactile reclamation of her environment. She sat in a worn but comfortable wingback chair, her fingers curled around a warm ceramic mug of tea. For the first time in over a year, her breathing was slow, even, and deliberate. Then, at exactly 7 o'clock, the fragile peace was shattered. A sudden, violent pounding erupted at the front door, an aggressive, rhythmic thudding, so heavy it vibrated through the floorboards and caused the teacup in her hand to rattle sharply against its saucer. The sound wasn't a request for entry. It was a demand for surrender. Elara did not flinch. She set the mug down on the side table with a steady, unhurried hand. Walking toward the foyer, she reached into the pocket of her newly purchased structured charcoal blazer, her thumb finding the smooth, tactile surface of her smartphone. With a single, silent swipe, she activated the high-fidelity voice recording application. She took a deep, stabilizing breath, filling her lungs with the crisp air of her home, and pulled open the heavy oak door. The freezing eastern wind swept into the hallway instantly, carrying the raw, metallic scent of the asphalt and the biting chill of the storm. Standing under the yellow glare of the porch light were Cassandra and Julian Thorne. Cassandra looked immaculately, almost violently shielded from the elements, wrapped in a plush, cream-colored Max Marwool coat that smelled heavily of expensive French perfume and damp fur, though her eyes were narrowed into two calculating, razor-thin slits. Beside her stood Julian, Big Victor, a towering, broad-shouldered man whose presence seemed to swallow the ambient light. He wore a tailored charcoal overcoat, his jaw clamped tightly around a glowing cigar that exhaled thick, suffocating plumes of gray smoke into the wet air. Without waiting for an invitation, Julian brushed past Elara, his heavy, mud-stained leather soles thudding ominously against the polished hardwood of her hallway. Cassandra followed, the wet silk of her scarf hissing against her coat as she stepped over the threshold and immediately closed the door behind them, sealing the three of them inside the narrow space. "Elara," Cassandra began, her voice dropping into a low, smooth, expertly calibrated purr of manufactured familial grief. She scanned the modest hallway with an overt, stinging condescension. "Look at this place. The heating is barely running, and it's freezing in here. We flew all the way from Arizona because we heard about the absolute madness your lawyer has been filing in the Cook County courts. We know you are grieving, Elara. We know you are lonely and not thinking clearly. But you are dragging Thomas's memory through the mud. This offshore trust was a private, sacred family arrangement. You are entirely out of your depth." Julian stepped into the center of the living room, his massive frame casting a long, intimidating shadow across the ceiling. He didn't look at the family photographs on the mantel. He looked at Elara as if she were a minor logistical error he was about to delete from a spreadsheet. He walked closer, stepping directly into her personal space until the suffocating odor of stale cigar smoke, expensive peppermint, and wet wool threatened to overwhelm her senses. "Let's cut the domestic garbage, Elara," Julian growled, his voice vibrating at a low, dangerous frequency that felt like a physical pressure against her chest. He leaned down slightly, his eyes cold and unblinking. "You think you're being clever with this Eleanor Penhaligon woman. You think finding a digital token makes you a player in a game you don't understand. But you need to think very carefully about what happens when you dig up a grave. Thomas wasn't a saint. His logistics company didn't just move commercial freight. It facilitated complex international asset movements that the federal government takes a catastrophic interest in. If you push this petition to a public evidentiary hearing, I will personally ensure that every single document is entered into the public record. I will drag Thomas's name through the federal mud until his memory is synonymous with a common criminal. Julian paused, letting the threat hang in the quiet room, like poison gas. He took a step closer, his eyes drilling into hers. And let's talk about you, Elara. You signed those joint federal tax returns every single April for over 2 decades. Under the law, ignorance is not an excuse. If I open the books on Miller Logistics Consulting, the IRS will come down on this house like a hammer. They will strip you of your tenure. They will seize every dime of your meager retirement, and you will be sitting in a concrete federal cell before the year is out. Is that what you want? Is a dead man's money worth your freedom? 24 months ago, or even 60 days ago, Elara would have shivered under the weight of that gaze. Her throat would have tightened with the familiar, suffocating panic of the invisible wife, the woman who had learned to apologize for taking up space, the woman who shrunk into the shadows whenever a man spoke with authority. Her hands would have shaken, and she would have begged for their forgiveness just to make the terrifying silence go away. But tonight, the air in her chest felt like pure, crystalline ice. She stood perfectly still, her spine straight and unyielding beneath the sharp, tailored lines of her new charcoal blazer. She didn't look down. She looked directly into Julian's arrogant, predatory eyes and let the silence stretch between them until it was Julian who shifted his weight, his boots creaking against the floorboards. "You are standing in my home, Julian," Elara said, her voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm, quiet, and metallic register that cut through the room like a scalpel. "And you have just explicitly threatened, harassed, and attempted to blackmail a citizen of this Commonwealth on her own property. Every word you just uttered, every threat of federal retaliation, has been captured on a secure digital recording. The leverage you think you hold over Thomas is dead. It died the moment I submitted his original handwritten confession and the complete Cayman ledgers to the Department of Justice under the Federal Innocent Spouse framework." The room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Julian blinked, a sudden, microscopic twitch fracturing the smooth, tan veneer of his jawline. The practiced, corporate confidence in his posture evaporated in a single heartbeat, replaced by a rigid, freezing realization. "You're bluffing," Cassandra hissed, her voice losing its smooth purr, her manicured nails digging so deeply into the leather of her designer handbag that the material groaned, her knuckles turning a sharp, bloodless white. "You don't have the stomach for a federal investigation, Elara. You're a part-time schoolteacher." "Try me," Elara whispered. The sound was incredibly soft, yet it carried the lethal, unmistakable slide of a blade being drawn from its scabbard. "Eleanor Penhaligon has already secured my provisional immunity. The government isn't looking at me, Cassandra. They are looking at the Scottsdale real estate syndicates. Now, remove yourselves from my property immediately before I call the federal marshal assigned to my protective case." For 3 seconds, no one breathed. Julian's mouth opened slightly, the cigar ash falling unnoticed onto his expensive overcoat. Then, without a word, he turned on his heel and marched toward the door, his movements frantic and stripped of their former grandeur. Cassandra scurried behind him, the cream fabric of her coat rustling like dry autumn leaves as they practically fled into the freezing November rain. Elara slammed the heavy oak door shut, locked it, and leaned her back against the solid wood. Her chest heaved as the adrenaline finally spiked through her veins, her hands trembling violently as she pressed the phone to her chest. But the trembling wasn't fear. It was the thrill of a captive who had just felt the lock turn. 3 days later, the true desperation arrived via a certified courier. Elara sat at her kitchen table, a single mug of black coffee steaming beside her, as she broke the green plastic seal on a thick envelope from Hardcastle and Ferris, LLC, the formidable legal empire based in Scottsdale. The heavy, textured bond paper, felt stiff, but the words printed upon it screamed of a total, panicked retreat. It was a formal, binding out-of-court settlement offer. They were offering her a flat, guaranteed sum of $15 million, paid out within 12 months into an account of her choosing, in exchange for a complete, permanent non-disclosure agreement, and the immediate, unconditional withdrawal of her probate petition in Cook County. That afternoon, the phone on the kitchen counter rang. It was Eleanor Penhaligon. "Elara," Eleanor said, her rich, bourbon-smooth voice crackling slightly through the speakerphone. "Julian's attorneys just called my office 3 times in the span of an hour. $15 million is an extraordinary, life-altering sum of money for an adjunct English instructor. It is a fortune that would ensure you never have to grade another essay or worry about a heating bill for the rest of your life. Most human beings on this earth would take the check, sign the paper, and never look back. It buys an immense amount of comfortable silence." Elara stood up from the table and walked over to the kitchen window. Outside, the gray Philadelphia rain had slowed, turning into a dirty, freezing slush that clung to the barren branches of the oak tree in the yard. She looked down at her hands. The skin was smoother now, no longer chapped from cheap dish soap, her nails neatly trimmed. She thought of her mother's broken, unoperated hip in 2017. She thought of the cold, dark parking lot where she had wept into a plastic flip phone, while $33 million sat accumulating interest in a tropical tax haven. She thought of the 26 years she had spent apologizing for the mere crime of existing, transforming herself into a ghost just to keep a cruel man comfortable. A sudden, sharp laugh escaped her throat, a beautiful, resonant, and entirely liberating sound that tasted like pure oxygen after a lifetime of drowning. "Eleanor," Elara said, her fingers tightening around the edge of the phone until her knuckles matched the white of the poplin shirt she wore. "Tell me exactly what the federal court and the state spousal provisions say I am legally, rightfully entitled to." $16,850,000. Eleanor replied without a single frame of hesitation, plus full fee reimbursements. "Then tell them no," Elara said, her jaw setting into a line of absolute, unyielding granite. "Decline the $15 million. I don't want their calculated mercy, and I don't want their hush money. I want a permanent public record of exactly what they stole from my family. We are going to court. Eleanor, prepare the briefs." The federal courtroom of the Cook County District Court was surprisingly small, but it possessed a heavy, hollow solemnity that pressed down on everyone inside. The air smelled of old wax, polished brass, and the cold, circulating air of a Chicago winter. Elara sat at the plaintiff's table, her fingers resting lightly on the cool mahogany surface. She wore no jewelry except her simple silver wedding ring, a deliberate choice that felt like an anchor to the 26 years of marriage being dissected under the harsh fluorescent lights. Across the aisle, Cassandra and Julian Thorne sat behind their high-priced legal team, their faces rigid, their eyes fixed firmly on the table to avoid Elara's gaze. When Judge Denise Fogarty took the bench, the entire room stood in absolute silence. She was a compact, sharp-eyed woman in her late 60s, her black robes rustling softly as she adjusted her glasses to read the 23-page preliminary ruling. The unraveling of the Thorne empire was methodical, dry, and devastating. Eleanor Penhaligon stood at the podium, her voice echoing with a calm, surgical precision as she laid out the final pieces of forensic accounting. The primary weapon was the undisputed evidence from June 2001, the bank records showing that the initial $40,000 used to fund Miller Logistics Consulting had been surreptitiously withdrawn from the inheritance left by Elara's father. Judge Fogarty didn't look up from her papers as she spoke, her voice carrying the undeniable weight of the law. "The court finds that the initial capitalization of the trust, having originated from the non-consensual misappropriation of the plaintiff's personal marital assets, constitutes a fundamental breach of fiduciary duty within the marital relationship. The ongoing, systematic concealment of these funds inside an offshore entity compounds this finding. A revocable or irrevocable trust cannot be used as a shield to perpetrate marital fraud. With a sharp, decisive rap of her gavel, the trap that Thomas had built finally snapped shut. The judge voided the trust's original beneficiary allocations. Elara was awarded her full, rightful spousal share, $16.85 million, along with an additional $50,000 for full legal fee reimbursement. But the true domino effect began the moment the court record became public. Because Elara had proactively secured her innocent spouse relief, she stood safely on the shore while the storm she unleashed obliterated her enemies. The court's official findings regarding the shell companies and the Cayman ledgers were immediately flagged by the Internal Revenue Service and the Department of Justice. Within 4 months, a federal grand jury issued subpoenas that froze every asset tied to Julian Thorne's real estate syndicates in Scottsdale. The remaining $16 million left in Thomas's offshore trust was seized by the government to cover decades of back taxes, fraud penalties, and interest. Julian's glamorous, predatory empire collapsed like a house of cards. His high-profile clients pulled their investments overnight. His broker's license was permanently revoked, and he and Cassandra were forced to sell their sprawling desert mansion with the infinity pool just to pay their criminal defense attorneys. They were left with nothing but the very real prospect of federal prison sentences for tax evasion and conspiracy. 2 years later, the afternoon air in suburban Philadelphia was warm, golden, and thick with the sweet, nostalgic scent of blooming honeysuckle. It was the golden hour, that precise fleeting moment before sunset when the world is bathed in a soft, amber glow that makes everything look gentle. Elara Sterling sat on a newly installed wrought iron bench beneath the sprawling shade of the grand oak tree in her backyard, the tree Thomas had planted during their very first year in the house. She closed her eyes, letting the gentle breeze brush against her face, listening to the soft, rhythmic rustle of the green leaves above. Her skin no longer felt tight with anxiety. Her shoulders were relaxed, her posture naturally poised and dignified. The money had changed her life, but not in the ways people imagined. The very first thing she had done was walk into a local appliance store, run her fingers over the pristine white enamel of the top-tier washing machine, and buy it without glancing at the price tag. A quiet, symbolic release of a lifetime of restraint. She had then worked with a financial advisor to establish the Helen Medical Fund, named in honor of her mother. The foundation had already fully subsidized life-altering joint surgeries for over 100 low-income families who, like her mother years ago, had been left stranded by the cruel gaps of health insurance. Elara still taught her literature courses at the community college, but her true passion had become a weekly writing workshop she developed for adult learners returning to education after surviving severe trauma, divorce, or loss. She watched her students find their voices, watching the exact moment the light came back into their eyes as they realized they were no longer invisible. She opened her eyes and looked up through the thick branches of the oak tree, watching the golden light filter through the canopy. She took a slow sip from her porcelain mug. The bitter taste of resentment had completely dissolved, replaced by a profound, hollow peace. She thought of Thomas. He was a deeply flawed, terrified man who had lived a lie, but in the end, his love and his guilt had driven him to leave her a door. She forgave him for the silence, because the silence had forced her to find her own voice. Elara smiled into the amber light, entirely free, entirely whole, and beautifully uninvisible. All shadows must fade before the truth, and every pain is simply the start of a beautiful rebirth. Always remember, the right to write a new chapter of your life is forever in your hands. Please like, share, and subscribe if this story resonated with you. Hope to see you on the next page.